for joining and welcome to Lead Dev Bookmark. Lead Dev is a global community of engineering leaders who come together to discuss all things leadership, teams, tools, and tech. Bookmark is our monthly book club, and this is our 16th event. I'm Suzan Bond, and I'll be your moderator for this discussion. I'm a former COO of a scaling startup, an executive coach, and a leadership consultant. My specialty is tech leaders. You can find me on Twitter with my name. Today we'll be talking about decision-making for software engineering teams by Francesco Strazzullo. It's a rough one. I tried my best. Do not look to me for the pronunciation, everybody.
No problem.
Even though I have a Sicilian husband, I still stumble over those names. If you have questions for Francesco, please pop them in the Q&A feature on Zoom. Francesco is a developer and partner at Flowing. He is also a speaker at tech conferences and meetups. He is the author of Frameless Front-End Development and Decision-Making for Software Development Teams. In his free time, he likes to relax playing with his PlayStation or cooking some strange ethnic dish for his wife. Okay, this is not part of my questions, but wait, PlayStation, give me a favorite game or two on PlayStation.
Final Fantasy. Final Fantasies, I really love all of them.
Very cool. I have not played, I can't remember what we have. I don't play them much, but PlayStation is one that I've always sort of been, what games are on there?
Okay.
Fantastic. So you wrote a book about frameless front-end development, as we talked about there in your description. I'm curious about maybe what that book is about and how it might be related to the book that you wrote here.
Yeah. Okay, because I wrote that book a couple of years ago after I made a workshop about writing applications without frameworks, okay, for front-enders, because I'm actually a front-ender at heart, okay? I'm a full-stack developer. I wrote a back-end, front-end, whatever happens, but at the core, I'm a front-end developer, JavaScript developer. So I wrote that book, and then people start to ask me, okay, I learned how to write an application without framework. But when I have to do that, what are the conditions where I don't have to rely on frameworks? And to answer that question, I started to study decision-making for developers. I took some decision-making techniques and applied to software development. The last chapter of the first book was called, if I remember correctly, the right tool for the right job. And it was the beginning, and then I expanded my thoughts and I said, okay, it's time to write a second book about this specific topic, decision making.
So this book was not really in your mind's eye when you wrote the first one, or was it something? No, it wasn't. Got it. Sort of developed as you thought about the topic more. You came to think about decision making with a more honed, specific focus.
Yeah, the first one was actually, very, very for developers, okay, for coders, because I wrote because I worked with a lot of legacy application for front end. So I learned how to work without framework because I needed to for my work. So it was just, okay, I want to give my knowledge to people. I want to share my knowledge to people about frameworkless. But after a while, it's been like opening a Pandora's box. Because when you give people a new tool, because if you think about it, no framework is just another option, okay? Because you have all the frameworks out there, and then you have another option because it's no framework. And after that, I start thinking with my colleagues, with my friends, with other consultants about, okay, how developers should make decisions. And I decided to write this second book.
Well, and I'm curious about why do you think it's so important for developers to study decision making? To think about it specifically.
Okay, good question. Because I think that most of the time, developers, and when I talk about developers, I'm talking about me, okay? I'm not talking from an ivory tower, okay? I do the same error every time. But you usually don't see the consequences of your choices. Because when you make a technical decision, it's very, very hard to see or to think about risks and consequences. You only see the good stuff. You can also see problems, but you don't think about risks or consequences, and you don't see the big picture. So sometimes I think that is good to stop for a moment, okay?
Yep.
And before making a strategic decision, try to see the problem for a lot of point of view, not just the technical one. Because also a technical decision can have a lot of consequences in the long run. I make an example. If you choose a framework or a language that it's not supported by your local community, for example, and you are not a remote first company, okay? In Flowing, we are a remote company, so we don't have the local problem. After a while, you can have a recruiting problem. You can find people to help you. So if you need to scale up, it could be a problem. And I saw a lot of companies that had that kind of problem. They observed the problem only from a technical point of view. I make an example. You can use Java for a product because you think it's the best technical solution, but all the people around you, around the company that you work with or the meetups or whatever you want, they use C#, for example. So you are alone, okay? So you don't see the context where you live in. This is why I tried to write this book. This is why I think this is an important topic. Try to see the big picture behind your decisions.
Well, yeah, and it's easy, because developers are technical. It's easy to get kind of really overly focused on that and to sort of forget context, despite our best interests, right?
Exactly.
And to not really think through that in a way that maybe is a little bit more holistic. So despite our well-meaning, of course, all well-meaning. And so that makes me think about what are the factors that developers need to consider in decision-making, right? We're what are all those, we talked about a little bit about local folks and all of that, but what other kinds of things should they consider?
Okay, I think that there are three main factors that you need to keep in mind, and they are taking the right data to make a decision, and to not talk about not useful variables. That will make an example in a moment. Then you have to gather the right people at the table, and you need to take a decision, and you need to design a process, a good process when making that decision, a collaborative process. I'm not sure that it is perfect in English, but in Italian, collaborative does not mean democratic. Okay, it does not mean that everybody decide. There could also be a tech leader that decide, but they could decide in a collaborative way. It's a process problem, not a decision problem. An example on the data that you need to decide. I can make a contrary example, a data that usually is not useful to the site, but the developers really love, and they are performances. For example, in the book, I wrote about a real use case. Okay, in the book, there are not real names, for privacy, but
Right.
I helped a developers team to choose a front-end framework, and they were focused on performances. And we were talking about a difference of milliseconds, okay, 50 milliseconds for a page load. And then, I said, I was thinking that it was not so important to talk about performances, okay? And how I solved that, how I tried to open their mind. I called at the table their customer support manager, and I asked him, it was an old he was also near to retirement, so it was quite funny. I said to him, okay, you work in this company for the last 15 years. There anyone talking about performances in the last 15 years? And I'm talking about users, not developers. And he answered, nobody. Nobody never talk about performance. And their product was not performant, not from a technical point of view, but it was not important for their clients. So they talked for days about how to gather, 50 milliseconds in rendering performance, but that was completely useless as a data to the site. That was the main problem, and this is.
Well, can I ask you a quick question? Yeah, so sorry, I want to ask a question about that. Like, why do you think they got stuck on that? Right? There's like the way you lay out, it's clear that like that performance wasn't really important. Why do you think they got stuck on that?
Okay.
You know what I mean? Like I said, because I think this is a common problem. I'm not singling them out. My guess is that this is a pretty common problem.
Okay. In that particular scenario, in that particular use case, in the particular case, there was a bias problem, because in that case, they already decided their framework. They wanted to work with, if I remember correctly, it was React. And they was trying to, have a confirmation bias. And so they start to say, you see, React is more performant, What was the main problem for them? They needed to create a tool that was used by other developers around it. They had a community, okay, that create plugins for them. To simply put, I said to them, okay, make a survey, ask your partners what framework they use usually. So it could be easier for them to integrate with your product if you use the same technology. Nobody uses React in their partner network. But they wanted to use React, so they started with tests that confirmed their decision. That was the problem.
Yeah. Confirmation biases. Yeah, that happens a lot.
Yeah, I think that is one of the problem when people focus on performance, is confirmation bias.
That's really great. I love that you brought that in, a psychology nerd. I'm like, yes, confirmation bias. That stuff sneaks up. Well, I'm curious if you can give us another quick example too about like in thinking about decision making, right people, like bringing the right people. What does that mean?
For example, you need to put at the table when you are making a very high level strategic decisions. Okay, I'm not talking about any code review. I'm talking about the decision that can drastically change the code base. Okay, frameworks, languages, architecture.
Yep.
An example is to always get someone that knows the users of your application. It may seem a stupid suggestion, but sometimes developer does not know anything about their users. They don't know the age or preferences, or if they have, some other tool that need to use together with your tool. And this is quite strange because developers tend to write, user stories for backlog, and they have the users in mind, but they don't really know the user. So when you're making technical decisions, I think that you always need somebody in the team that knows your user. It could be a customer support manager, it could be an UX designer, or user research if the product does not exist. And then you also need I think that some business people, somebody that knows why that product exists in the first place. I'm talking about an elevator pitch. I'm talking about a business model, something like that. A good experiment that you can do to understand if a developer team knows their product is to let them write down a simple elevator pitch for their product. It's quite funny because everybody concentrate on technical problems and not on the user problem that you are solving with your product.
That's so good. Okay, let's go through the last one real quick before I have a bunch more questions. I'm so curious. Can we just give a little bit more about the third one, which was the process part? Just maybe a small example about what you mean by like what to consider in that.
For example, I can make a couple of examples. The first one is to also when you made a decision alone, for example, if you because you are a CTO, okay, you can decide everything on your own.
Yep.
But just don't just communicate the decision, but also communicate to your team why the decision has been made. Okay, this is, it may seem very simple, but it helps people to understand what is happening, why people choose this thing, because, and you need to keep track of this decision during the life of a software, because it could be, you know, you take a decision, you make a decision 10 years ago, probably that decision is not good anymore, but you have in the code base some pieces of code that are still in the old way. Okay, imagine a very legacy code. You have usually you have stratification. You have very old code. You have old code. You have young code. From somebody that is arriving in the project, something new, if they don't know the history of the decisions, they can't understand what is happening. Or if you want to be more collaborative, okay, but you want to keep, you know, some differences between juniors, seniors, and tech leaders, I usually suggest to use a meeting technique called fishbowl. Fishbowl. Okay, I can't spell it in English. Okay, it's the bowl of the red fish.
Yep, you got it. You got it. Great.
Okay, thank you. Okay, perfect. And how it works? Imagine that you have 20 people at a meeting, and you have 5 senior on or tech leader. Okay, and the other 15 are junior or middle developer. And you want to make a decision in a democratic way, but you know, giving the tech leader more power. Okay, because they have more experience. In this way, you can create, okay, an inner circle with the 5 senior developer, and then they start talking for a time box. I don't know, 15 minutes. Only the inner circle can talk. The outer circle cannot speak. Okay. After the 15 minutes, you can just switch place. A senior goes out in the outer place, a junior come in the inner place. In this way, what happens? That you have the time for the senior developer to imprint the discussion in a good way. But you can get a lot of feedback from junior developers, a lot of different point of view.
Yes, so they help frame it. Yeah, so they help frame that.
Exactly.
Oh, that's so wonderful. Oh, that's great. I love that technique.
Because you have a lot of time, because if you have 5 people, for example, and you have a time box of 15 minutes, you have an hour of discussion where the majority is formed by senior developer.
Well, and I love what I love about that too, is like you're structuring the conversation. So it's not just going on and meandering without, like, there's some structure. It's allowing it a brainstorm, but in a way to structure it so that it doesn't, so that it keeps moving.
Exactly. This is it, to think about with the side. This is a point. This is what I mean with process.
Oh, that's so good.
Another thing why this is quite important, we're talking about process, is to visualize constraints with graphs or something like that. Okay, we usually do that with deadlines. Okay, you have Gantt, you have burn down charts, but you don't visualize technical constraints. It's quite rare to see them. If you move quality, if you don't write tests, for example, what happens? It's not so easy to let people understand what happens without a chart or some kind of visualization about what is the software quality that we need.
Oh, that's so good. These are so great. Okay, I have more. I'm gonna try to get to a couple more questions here. This is like so useful. So you mentioned in the book a few anti-patterns that you've observed. And I think I guess, I like, maybe what are those, anti-patterns? I mean, one that surprised me, I will say, was the expert one. I think most of us think like expertise, it's a good thing. Wait, how is that an anti-pattern? So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe that one and other anti-patterns.
Yeah, there is this anti-pattern I call the expert, not because expertise is not a good thing. Okay, of course it's a good thing, but when you delegate a strategic decision to an outside expert, the expert cannot see the whole picture. You can call expert to solve a complicated problem. For example, okay, I have a very, very huge database and my database is very, very slow. How can I speed up my database? On the contrary, if I have to choose between SQL Server, Oracle, or MongoDB, Elasticsearch, or Firebase, or DynamoDB, I don't know. It's a complex matter. You just don't need to use look at performances or other stuff. The expert can just give you data. You should not take the decision for the team. The expert could give an advice, but if you delegate the decision to the expert, I think that is an anti-pattern because they can't know your context, but not because they are not good, okay? Because it's impossible for them.
Right, they're not living it, so they're missing some information and some intricacies or complexity in there that.
Exactly, because some of this information are unspoken, okay? Because you live in that particular moment in that particular company. So if you came from the outside, it could be dangerous, okay? Because you don't know stuff. And I'm saying that because I'm a consultant, so people ask me for advice, and I advised a lot of teams. And after a while, you talk with team that you talked 2 years ago, and they say, okay, it was not good for me to advise them because I didn't know what happened before. So your vision is strict when you are an expert from the outside. You can call a pool of experts, but the decision should be made by the internal team.
I love that. I'm curious about other anti-patterns and maybe a couple other anti-patterns that you might want to sort of talk about that you've noticed in your work.
Yeah, I think the most interesting one is what I call rage-driven decisions. And this is when, I don't know, you talk with a team, you need to choose a new framework for a product, okay? And the only thing that they want is to not use the same framework that they used before. They don't really care about what they will decide, but the only thing that they know is that they will not use the same thing as before, because they have a lot of rage about their code. The funny thing is that, and I think in the book I talk about my personal experience, because I worked in Java for a lot of years, and then I decided to, okay, I don't care, I want to write JavaScript code. And because I thought that the problem was with the old frameworks that I was using at the time, or with Java, the reality was the problem was with myself. I was not a good programmer at the time. Okay, so I have a lot of rage about Java, about Hibernate. I don't remember what was the stack at the time. After a while, I came up and I said, okay, it was my fault. And this is the problem. It's not so easy to understand that most of the time, the problem is not in the framework, but is in the context, in the process that you are working with. Okay. Okay, there are technologies that are better than others. I'm not saying this, but I'm saying that most of the time, that rage is unuseful and cloud your vision. Okay, you have a lot of bias about that.
Emotions, right? We get our emotions.
Yeah, exactly.
Sort of involved in our decision-making process, and I think sometimes we don't even maybe we don't even really recognize that it's gotten tangled up.
Exactly. I observed this the anti-patterns because I started to help people to decide. And taking a look at team from outside helped me to make decision better for me, because oh, they have bias, but they are not stupid. They are a group of splendid developers. So why they have bias? Because it's natural. Okay, it's also inevitable in a way. So to see things from another angle can really help, because you can look at yourself better. So this is what these anti-patterns that I described in the book. I have made all the errors that I've wrote them for them. Okay, I'm not perfect, and I'm still not perfect. Okay, right now, because it's natural.
Yeah, we learn from our mistakes, right? We can figure out like, oh yeah, I've made that mistake and that mistake and that mistake.
Exactly.
That's the joy of like living more life. You're like, oh wait, I can see more mistakes that I've made.
Exactly.
I love that. Just a couple more questions. Where do you see teams struggle the most when it comes to making technological decisions? Like, where do you see them sort of maybe getting tripped up the most?
Okay. I think that they trip the most when they have to came up with uncertainty. Because most of the time, business people needs certainty. Okay, I need this stuff in 6 months. And
I got a marketing plan, I got a business plan, I got to meet I got a board, I got to meet there. Yep.
And developers struggle in that scenario because they have a lot of constraints, and so they tend to use always the same stuff until they become bored, because it's natural you want to try new stuff.
Yep.
And then you start struggling because you want to try new stuff, but you can't, and you don't have a process to introduce new stuff in a good way. So you become frustrated. This is the thing, I think, the thing that people struggle the most with.
So is part of it thinking about how to introduce it? Is that one of the barriers, as you said, or is it more than that?
I think that is more than that, but there are some patterns that you can use to gracefully introduce new technologies in a company. And this is called, I can come with 2 patterns, trying to remember. The first one is called innovation tokens. Every year, a CTO or a tech lead, somebody that has some kind of power, can mint free innovation token, for example. That teams can say, I want to introduce a new technology in this microservice, and I want to introduce this stuff in this, for example, in this mobile application. And so you can introduce them little by little, and in the safe and context. The other one is called the Goldilocks governance model. Goldilocks is a fable with a girl with the 3 bears. I think I don't remember correctly, but
you got it correctly. Yep.
It's okay, perfect.
Good memory.
And the metaphor here is to choose 3 standard stack for simple, intermediate, and complex problems. So you don't have to choose what is the best framework for my problem, but you have to choose is simple, it's intermediate, or it's a complex problem. And then you make the decision upfront. It's not perfect because, if you make decisions upfront, it's not tailored on the problem, but it can help to give some kind of liberty to the teams without, because our corporates are afraid of, they love standardization, because it's, I understand why they love standardization.
Predictability, right? There's a lot of predictability.
Exactly. But the Goldilocks governance model could be, a way to introduce new stuff, because you say, this is a simple problem. I have to create a login form. Okay, how can I did it thousands of times. I can use a simple stack, and the simple stack could be something completely new. Could be also something, if you want, a bit exotic for that company. I mean, okay, not in general, but if you have a Java company, to introduce, for example, Haskell, that is a pure functional programming, could be very, very exotic. So you can introduce that if you want, but in a safe environment and in a safe to fail experiment, if you want.
Yeah, it strikes me that a lot of your work is about providing maybe ways to think about it, being conscious about it, like some structures and really being conscious. And as I always think about, like, talk about the talking, which means like, let's talk about how we're going to talk. Let's talk about how we're going to make decisions.
Exactly. I will, in the book, I will not talk about decision by itself. I'm talking about the process. I'm talking about the data that you need to gather. I will not compare Java with C# because it will be unuseful. I want to show people how can they compare two languages based on their context, on their problem.
Yeah, it's like how to think about it rather than here's the right thing. I was certain, like, well, in what context? That's what people say. Well, what's the right thing to do? I'm like, well, what's the context? What are you trying to do? What's happening?
Exactly.
What's the legacy of, I think about like organizational debt and organizational legacy, thinking about that. So there's a lot of comparisons there. Okay, one last question. I'm so excited about this book. So you're still writing the book for all folks. It's you've got a few chapters done, but I know you're working on 2 chapters right now. No pressure. Not saying when you're going to have them out. I'm curious, what can folks see in these chapters?
Okay, the 5th chapter is almost ready because I write it in collaboration with a colleague of mine that is an UXer, and this is about the importance of UX for developers, and this is about what are the exercises that I need to gather information from my users, and how that information can influence my decision. Like, for example, I don't know, age, gender, also, or other, ethnographic information about people. The other one, the 6th chapter, is about gathering all that information that are not related to the technical problem. For example, I will show an exercise called the trade-off slider that is about understand the trade-off between, for example, budget and quality. Okay, you can't have both. You can't have a very, very small budget and a very high level of quality. And you have a couple of exercises to understand what happens if they clash, because sometimes you have to make a decision based on this data, and you need to visualize them, because if developers makes all the decision thinking about quality, it's natural for developers to think about it, and they don't.
Right, they want to produce a good work, right? They want to do a good craft and produce good work.
Exactly, but they don't know that in specific context there is a budget problem. They will be very, very will make harmful decisions. Okay. On the contrary, they think, because it's we always did the thing in this way, something like that. I think budget is important, but they don't get that for that particular context. I don't know, they are moving money, for example. Okay, they're moving bank accounts. Quality is their most top priority, so they need to shift their mind. And this is the trade-off slider is a tool that you can find, I think, in the Atlassian playbook about agile exercises. And this is a way to visualize the context, the difference between elements that make context of a product. This is the 2 chapters that I'm working on, and they will be available, I think, in August.
Okay, I'm not holding you to it. But that's really interesting too. That 2nd chapter too is thinking, again, it's like helping developers think outside of their narrow context, because the budget and the quality are maybe places of friction point that need to be resolved between business and technology needs, which need to come together in order to really
Exactly.
provide a good product.
Exactly. Other examples could be maintainability and performances. Okay, because okay, I'm talking about extreme consequences. Okay, it's not so in the real world, but for example, if you want to be extremely performant because you're working with 3D graphics, you don't care about maintainability most of the time, because you need to work on the chip as low as possible. Okay. On the other hand, you don't need that kind of performance where you are creating, for example, an enterprise product, I don't know, a CRM, for example. So you create a maintainable product. But this is quite simple, okay, when you need to choose performances and when you need to choose maintainability. But in the real life, it's not so easy. There are a lot of elements that are together and that they are opposing forces, like budget and quality, for example, or deadline. Okay, if you want, it's similar.
Yep, I'm really sorry. I live in New York City. I'm sorry for the horn honks.
Don't worry.
Couldn't catch that fast enough. Yeah, I love that idea too of like opposing forces. And again, how do we making conscious and how do we sort of work through potentially opposing forces in our decision making so we don't sort of get to our place to a, get to a place that's sort of untenable. So I have one more question for you.
No problem.
When you were, it sounds like, you wrote the first book and then you went through and you thought about decision making. And so it sounds like you did a lot more thinking and research specifically about decision making and thinking about that. What was one thing that maybe surprised you that you discovered or that might surprise other people?
I think that the thing that surprised me the most was about bias and the importance of emotions in decision making. Because as a developer, I think that I have everything under control. Okay, because my work is to control machines. Okay.
Right. Literally.
Exactly. This is the way my mind works. Okay. I need to keep stuff under control. But it's not like that. This is what my haha moment when I discovered that I was driven by emotion when I was making decision. Also, when I thought that I was looking at stuff from just an engineering point of view. The performances example that I make before, I made it the same mistake a lot of times. This is when I started to study biases, it was very, very cool. I have a problem.
I love that. I mean, as a psychology major, sociology major, I'm like, yes, bias and emotions. I mean, I do think that we don't think about it. And particularly, I mean, it makes a lot of sense because as developers, I mean, we do think, I'm not a developer. I can code a little bit. No one wants me to write their code. Okay. But I think as developers, part of your job is, like you said, to control the machine. And you do think about human behavior because you have to think about maybe how someone might be interacting with an application or a piece of software. But maybe it's like it slips by easily about your own emotions and how that might get tangled into the process of making software in unexpected ways.
Exactly. This is why I think it's important to design a process when you have to make decisions, because a process can help, remove emotions. Okay, not to remove, it's not correct. It's to reduce the impact of the emotions on your decision, okay, because you are visualizing your constraints. This is the most important thing that I learned in these 3 years, I think, that I'm studying this stuff.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining us during the session. Francesco will be heading over, joining us over on Lead Dev Slack, where he'll be taking some questions. So head over to Bookmarked channel where that'll be taking place. Thanks so much, everybody.